Today we're going to talk about Lesson 4, the time period right after Reconstruction. So, first of all, we need to talk about the election of 1868 and actually re-election of 1872. So Ulysses S. Grant, was president, remember? And unfortunately for Grant, his presidency did not go very well. There were several problems that happened. One was a big economic depression during his second term. Part of that was when a big bank declared bankruptcy and everyone panicked and thought all the money was going to be unsafe, and they started pulling their money out, and it's called the Panic of 1873. This started a depression that lasted for a long time. So that's terrible. And then on top of that, he had a lot of scandals. Unfortunately, he had a lot of people in his presidency that were not good people to pick to run, and they were doing things that were illegal and things like that. So unfortunately, things did not go very well for him, and that therefore is going to have a negative effect for the Republican Party in general. So in the next elections for Congress, the Democrats are able to win a lot of seats back and gain more control. So the radical Republicans are losing the power that they had. The Southern Democrats also worked really hard to try to get control of their state governments again. If you recall, we had talked about how they tried to intimidate the African Americans not to vote. The use of the Ku Klux Klan and other intimidation factors helped the Democrats to gain control again of their own governments, and they called themselves redeemers because they were going to redeem or save their state from that black Republican rule that we had talked about last time. All right, and then the election of 1876, presidential election, Rutherford B. Hayes runs for the Republicans, and he is more moderate, so they're hoping that that will make sure that they get enough votes. And then Samuel Tilden ran for the Democrats. Now, interestingly, there was a problem because in this election, there were some disputed results to the election in 3 states: Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. And those states, the Republicans said, no, we know we had the votes and they're not reporting. So maybe they pulled something and their votes didn't get counted. So they decided to have a committee in Congress to try to figure out what were they going to do about these disputed votes. The commission ended up deciding to go ahead and give the disputed votes to Hayes, so Hayes would have enough electoral votes to win the majority and win the election, and just by a little, by 1 vote, so it was very close. And this is not the first time that we've had a presidential election have some major problems or disputes. You guys weren't born, maybe, depends, around 2000 there was a big thing with the presidential election of Bush and Gore, and there were we've talked about hanging chads was, you can look it up, it's really interesting about the votes weren't counted correctly, and they pretty much after the fact, most people believe that Gore really should have won the election, but the disputed votes, the Supreme Court ruling helped to make Bush that end up being the winner. So anyway, this is not the first time that we've had a disputed presidential vote, so to make sure that it went over and they didn't have too much trouble, actually there was kind of like a deal they made, and the deal with the Democrats was, okay, don't cause waves, let this happen, we'll have the president be a Republican, but we promise we will start taking the troops out of the South. And so because of that deal, you'll start to see the South the white Southerners can kind of take back the South again. Okay. All right. In the meantime, let's talk about the economy. So the South, has been traditionally agricultural, and there were a lot of people who thought that we need to build like a new South during this Reconstruction time. We need to change things. We need to have more industries, not just farming. The industries that did grow up were related to what they already had. So, for instance, we know that they farmed a lot of cotton. They decided to build textile mills or grow tobacco, and then of course they had tobacco companies. So there were some industries that grew up. However, this new idea of really changing the economy of the South never really happened. It is like it could have happened, right? They have a cheap labor source. There was a big boom in building railroads again after the war, but the problem was that basically people needed money, and when they need to borrow money, to pay off their debt. Remember we talked about like using credit and to buy their supplies, and then they have to pay off their debt. So because they're poor and they're doing sharecropping and they need to pay off the debts, people still relied on cash crops, feeling that those are going to be reliable, right? And so unfortunately, those cash crops, as everyone starts growing cash crops, like for example, cotton, right? Everyone's growing so much cotton that supply and demand, right? The supply is high, so the demand is lower, and therefore the prices are lower. And so then, of course, since they're getting less for it, they want to grow more cotton, right? And it increases the dependency on growing cash crops. So unfortunately, that idea of trying to diversify and not have everyone doing cash crops did not happen. So the economy of the South stayed pretty much the same as it was before. All right, and then talking about how it ended up in the South. So that deal where they took the military out basically left the African Americans without that protection that was happening from the military, right? And so the white Southerners started doing things to try to take away their rights, and there's not that Republican-backed military to stop them. So, for instance, do you remember they made the 15th Amendment, which said you can't deny someone the right to vote because of their race? Well, okay, they can't go out directly and say it, that we're not going to let you vote because of your race, but they put in local laws in certain states to make sure that they wouldn't be able to vote. So, for instance, here's one, the poll tax. A poll tax is an amount that you charge at the polls to vote, okay? And they know that African Americans are poor, right? So they won't be able to afford the tax, and therefore they won't be able to vote. So it's like an indirect way to keep them from voting. Okay, here's another example. Literacy tests. Literacy is the ability to read and write. So they know that African Americans are not very well educated, right? Even though they've started educating, they're not that far along. And so they made it so that you had to read and explain parts of the Constitution, either the state constitution or the federal constitution. So since they're not very educated, they know that African Americans won't be able to pass that. Now, as you've probably thought of already, there are definitely some white Southerners, sharecroppers and such, right, that do not have the education or the money to pass these things, right, the poll taxes or the literacy tests. And they didn't want the whites not to vote, so they put another thing in there called a grandfather clause. And if your father or grandfather was able to vote before Reconstruction happened, then you could still vote. Which, of course, automatically, who could vote before? Not African Americans, right? So they're purposely saying, oh, white people can still vote if your father or grandfather did, and then African Americans, I guess that means you can't, right? So it's another indirect way to not call it out because they're of their race, right, of the African Americans, but they're doing it purposely to keep them from voting. Okay. And of course, there's all that intimidation and violence that we've been talking about too, that to ensure that. All right, and then let's talk about Jim Crow laws. I know you've talked about them before in the English classes. They wanted, they can't do anything about the African Americans being free now, but they don't want them near them, right? They don't want them to be using the same facilities that they do. So they put in a series of different segregation laws. So, for instance, that's what Jim Crow laws are, right? Basically keeping them separate. So, for instance, Plessy versus Ferguson is a very important Supreme Court case that was trying to say that segregation was not okay. And the Supreme Court voted in favor of segregation is okay. It's interesting, right? Because at the time, the white people who are in the Supreme Court are, in the old ways, and they are not thinking it's that bad. So in this particular one, it was about a train. That they said that they didn't think you should have to sit in separate sections for African Americans and whites. And the court ruled, no, it's okay that they're separate as long as they have equal right to go on the train. And so that separate but equal idea happens for a long time. They use that as an excuse why segregation is okay, even though in reality, it's not really equal, right? We know for a fact that, for example, schools, right? They didn't spend the money on the facilities for schools the same. So even though they did have education, it wasn't as good as the whites. So they claim it's separate but equal, but really as long as you offered it at all, they considered that equal. Okay, so that happens in the South. And then also, in addition to the Jim Crow laws, we see a big increase in violence against African Americans. So we have not only like the intimidation and beating them up and things, we also see lynching. And I want to just make it clarity. So lynching means you're killed, like an angry mob comes and takes you and kills you. It can and often is by hanging, but it doesn't have to be. Lynching doesn't technically mean hanging them. It means killing them. Often though by hanging, I will admit. Okay. So you know about this. We've talked about this in English, right? That it was either because they were suspected of crime or just because they weren't acting like the whites thought, right? Being respectful, getting off the sidewalk, things like that, right? Okay, and then, of course, many of the African Americans are not enjoying what the South is becoming, right? And so many of them decide to leave. And so one big group that decided to leave, they were called the Exodusters. Okay, so the Exodus, and you'll learn about this in 8th grade, is when the Jews were enslaved in Egypt and Moses leads them out of that slavery. It's called the Exodus when they leave and find their homeland. Okay, so that's why the Exodusters is talking about leaving the Exodus, and they're migrating to Kansas. So that's where the dust comes in. So more than 20,000 African Americans moved to Kansas trying to make a new life for themselves. The other thing is a second idea of how African Americans could get out of this situation, try to make a better life, is to become a soldier. Okay, that's an opportunity for them to have a job, and they can get out of the South. They travel all over. One of the big places that needed soldiers is in the West. There's a bunch of conflicts with Native Americans as we are expanding more in the West. And that's where a nickname comes for these African American soldiers. They were called Buffalo Soldiers. We're not sure exactly. Apparently, like some of the African Americans, maybe they kind of looked the coloring like the buffalo. I'm not really sure why they called them that, but they did call them. And then the soldiers kind of took that name on and made it their own. Okay. And so they also served all over the place, not just in those Native American wars. All right, and so that's pretty much it. They just sum it up. So the Reconstruction, it did its job. It rebuilt the economy. Although the economy is not really much different, it's really agricultural and poor, right? Um, African Americans had some good equality for a while, got to vote, got to, run some government and be in the government for a while. But then once the Democrats took back over again, then, those opportunities went away. So it became more biased and violent and things again. Okay, we're going to stop there.